The headline said, U.S. wheat shipments rejected. But it wasn't just rejection. It was abandonment. Quiet, devastating, and almost invisible. In Kansas, grain towers are full, not because harvests were good, but because nobody came to pick them up. In Oklahoma, a man burned 400 acres of wheat, not because he wanted to protest, but because the grain had nowhere to go, and no one left to harvest it. Ice raids in early 2025 ripped through seasonal farming communities. The hands that once fed America, gone. According to CNN, thousands of undocumented farm workers vanished overnight. What followed wasn't dramatic. It was silent. No protests, no headlines, just crops rotting, trains not moving, and customers overseas, they stopped calling. America didn't lose the wheat war with a bang. It bled out, contract by contract, until the silos became tombstones of a system that used to work. So, what happened? Why did even our oldest trade partners turn away? Without a word, let's start with the closest one, Mexico. Mexico didn't slam the door. They just stopped answering. For decades, they were America's most loyal wheat customer, reliably importing over 3 million tons a year. From soft flour for street tortillas to bulk shipments for processing plants, U.S. wheat was baked into Mexico's food system. But in the spring of 2025, something shifted. A shipment meant for Sonora sat idle at the Texas border. Not because of protest or price, but because of a new export declaration form. One the shipper hadn't seen, one customs hadn't clarified, one that cost an entire contract. According to Reuters, that wasn't the only one. Repeated documentation changes, from licensing codes to inspection formats, made cross-border trade feel like roulette. One small error, days of delays, hours of shutdowns, thousands in lost inventory. Mexico wasn't angry. They were exhausted, so they turned north, to Canada. There, importers found quiet consistency, clean forms, no surprise tariffs, no ICE interference mid-shipment. By mid-2025, Canadian wheat exports to Mexico surged by over 35%, while American imports fell by nearly 40%. No statement was issued, no warning given, just fewer calls, fewer trains, fewer deals. And while policymakers in D.C. debated competitiveness, a new trade corridor was already forming, one that flowed neatly from Calgary to Guadalajara. But what happened next wasn't across the border. It was right in America's own backyard. Kansas didn't have a shortage. It had too much. By the second quarter of 2025, Bloomberg reported a 42% increase in unsold wheat stockpiled across central Kansas. Trains sat idle on rusting rails. Grain elevators hit capacity. Some were forced to store wheat in plastic-covered fields exposed to weather, rodents, and risk. The irony? It was one of the best harvests in years, but with buyers in Mexico, France, and South Korea stepping away, there was nowhere for that wheat to go. Processing facilities that once ran 24 hours a day started shutting down. In Amarillo, a blending plant quietly closed its gates. In El Paso, another facility laid off 70 workers. In Arizona, millers reported slashing orders by half just to avoid overcapacity. Farmers tried everything, cutting prices, bundling contracts, even offering free transport. It wasn't enough. The buyers weren't hesitating because of price. They were hesitating because of politics, paperwork, and uncertainty. And the frustration ran deep. As one farmer in Salina put it, "We're growing more than ever and making less than ever." While the U.S. debated tariffs and defended headlines, Canada was building refrigerated rail cars and digitizing port logistics. In the end, the wheat wasn't spoiled. But the trust behind it was. And in South Korea, where food safety is sacred, that breakdown was about to trigger a much sharper rejection. It wasn't the price. It wasn't the politics. It was the chemical signature. In mid-2025, South Korean health regulators flagged multiple U.S. wheat shipments for exceeding glyphosate residue limits. Some tested at 400 parts per billion, double the country's legal threshold. No press release followed, no formal ban, just a shift in supply. Canadian and Australian shipments began docking in Busan and Incheon. American wheat quietly disappeared from the manifest. Bloomberg confirmed that by July, Canada made up more than 60% of Korea's wheat imports, up from just 28% the year before. American share? Below 10%. In Spokane, a wheat processing mill slashed production by 20%. It once supplied frozen dough to Korean retailers. In Idaho's Palouse region, some farmers ripped up their wheat. They pivoted to flaxseed and lentils crops with lower scrutiny and more stable demand. The damage wasn't loud, it was humiliating. To Korean consumers, glyphosate wasn't just a chemical, it was a betrayal of safety. And to American exporters, it was a silent dismissal they couldn't argue against. In the end, South Korea didn't make a scene. They just made other plans. But not every market walked away politely. Some, like France, walked away with leverage. France didn't make a scene. They didn't hold press conferences or threaten retaliation. They just made other arrangements. By March 2025, milling companies in Marseille, Lyon, and Rouen quietly pivoted away from U.S. wheat. The reason? Failure to meet new EU environmental documentation standards, especially carbon traceability and pesticide residual reports. In international trade, trust is a certificate. Lose it and the doors close. According to Reuters, American wheat imports into France dropped to a 2-decade low that spring. Canadian suppliers, already aligned with European reporting formats, filled the vacuum. In some cases, the switch took less than 10 days. The baguette stayed crisp. The croissants still flaked. But somewhere along the way, the American name disappeared from the invoice. And for farmers in the Great Plains, the impact wasn't immediate, but it was deep. Orders slowed. Processing plants idled. Even state AG offices stopped printing new export materials because no one was asking. In the end, it wasn't a protest. It was a phase-out. A slow erosion of relevance, signed off by silence. And while France changed partners, another rupture was forming closer to home, where immigration raids weren't just seizing people, they were seizing harvests. Italy didn't hold a press conference. There were no headlines in Rome, no protests in Naples, just silence. But in the numbers, the story was loud. By summer 2025, Italy's import of U.S. durum wheat had dropped to 15%. Canada, once a secondary supplier, now held nearly half the market. What changed? According to EU agricultural trade data, Canadian exporters delivered wheat with tighter moisture control, consistent protein levels, and punctual delivery windows. Over time, Italian buyers began to trust them the way they once trusted American suppliers. And when it comes to pasta, consistency isn't luxury, it's law. In Bologna and Bari, quality isn't negotiable. And when buyers need to know their next shipment will match the last, down to the gram, they don't take chances. One Italian importer put it plainly. We didn't choose Canada because it was cheaper. We chose them because they didn't surprise us. That wasn't just logistics. That was loyalty, earned through reliability. For American growers, the sting wasn't about losing a contract. It was about being left behind by people who never looked back. America didn't just lose customers. It lost the rituals, the relationships, the rhythm of being wanted. And by the time it noticed, the calls had already stopped. No flags were lowered. No sanctions announced. No breaking news banners filled the screen. But one by one, the calls stopped coming. Mexico turned north. France turned east. Korea turned inward. Even Italy, where pasta is tradition, found a new partner. And the U.S., it watched, as relationships slipped through the cracks of missed paperwork, late shipments, and shifting standards. It wasn't sabotage, it was substitution. Not because the wheat wasn't good enough, but because the follow-through wasn't. Buyers didn't need a perfect price. They needed to know the truck would come, that the shipment would pass, that the deal would hold. In a world balancing climate shocks, food insecurity, and global tension, reliability isn't an asset, it's survival. The wheat stayed in the ground, but something else fell: credibility. And unlike crops, that doesn't grow back in one season. So the question isn't whether America can sell wheat again. The question is whether the world will believe it when it says, "We've changed.